Stuart policies on Catholicism in Ulster were manifestly like those followed with respect to the Scottish Gaels. In contrast to James VI and I's predecessors, the essence of Crown policy was to seek social reform rather than promote wholesale social dislocation. This policy replaced his initial failed attempt in 1598 to plant lowland Scots on the island of Harris. Under the king's cousin, the Duke of Lennox, the colonists called the Fife Adventurers were under no illusions about their mission. They were to put the residents on Lewis to the sword, making it clear for further settlement of colonists from the lowlands. The adventurous settlers and the agents of social change attempted to build a small town called Stornoway, but they soon became dismayed by the wet climate and the persistent harassment by locals. The Gaels proved to be strong opponents, forcing James to rethink his strategy to rid the island of them. To him, it seemed more prudent to bring about social and cultural change through education, so James developed a plan to use the established Protestant church for that purpose. Now remember, a Protestant church that's called an established church over there was a state-controlled or monarchy-controlled institution, not a private get-together sort of church like the Baptist church here in the United States. No, it was the government's run or operated institution called the Church of Scotland, the Kirk, what have you. The king ordered Lord Deputy Chichester to bring about Anglicization through church instruction and to refrain from requiring oaths of ecclesiastical supremacy or allegiances on the Irish natives. Perhaps the king wanted to only exclude biological genocide from his methods because the plan he chose was clearly intended to bring about the death of his realm's Gaelic culture, for he loathed it. As James I wrote in Basilicon Doran, "Those that dwelleth in our mainland, that are barbarous for the most part, and yet mixed with some show of civility. The other that dwelleth in the isles, and are utterly barbarous without any sort of show of civility." James's ideas about the Scottish and Irish Gaels are shown in the manner in which he treated the chiefs from the Isles. In 1608, he asked Lord Ochiltree to help him in a scheme to bring about cultural change among them. The plan called for tricking the chiefs into a snare from which their release was contingent upon their agreeing to certain conditions dictated to them by Andrew Knox, the Bishop of the Isles. Those conditions, spelled out in a document known as the Statutes of Iona, were forced upon the chiefs in 1609. The statutes were followed in 1616 by legislation that further impacted the traditional lifestyles of future generations by requiring leading families in Scottish Gaeldom to send their children to the lowlands for instruction in the English language. Now you got to keep in mind here that there were obviously Scandinavian descendants who lived in and amongst the Scots there in the Isles and the Hebrides, for example, but their culture was deemed as Gaelic by King James. So don't write me to complain that there were Vikings descendants living there. I know they were, but the king, we're talking about what the king thought and what the king's actions were about. Anyway, under the king's actions, the chiefs were responsible for the conduct of every member of their respective clans. Limits were established for the size of their households, the number of war galleys that they maintained, feasting and drinking, carrying firearms, and exacting hospitality from their followers. Bards, troublemakers whose heroic poetry was liable to incite violence, were to be suppressed. Lowlanders in the Isles worth 60 cows or more were to have their eldest sons, in the 1616 Act, all their children, educated in the lowlands and taught English. The king was concerned more about their loyalty and wild lifestyle than he was with their religion, although a purely secularized education didn't exist in the lowlands at the time. James intended to plant anglicized settlers in Ulster to drive a wedge between the Gaels in Scotland and their friends and relations in Ireland. It so happens that these Gaels, who the king regarded as barbarians, were also Roman Catholics, and those who chose to serve as anglicizing wedges were mostly Calvinist Protestants, still celebrating their Reformation and liberation from the evils of papacy. Clearly, there was antipathy among the Protestants for Roman Catholics, so conflict was inherently built into the plantation scheme, even if other aspects of cultural genocide could be removed from the scenario. The Statutes of Iona encouraged Catholic migration to Ulster. This migration was facilitated by clan ties and well-established western sea routes. The MacDonalds of Kintyre lost political ground to the Protestant Earl of Argyll, Archibald Campbell, who had the support of the King's Court. The numerous septs of the MacDonalds who were politically discredited, so they too crossed the North Channel of the seemingly receptive MacDonald lands in Antrim. Catholic migration was severely dampened after the 1641 Rising was quelled. That's the Catholic Rising in Ireland. The Rising was facilitated, believe it or not, by Charles I, Archbishop William Laud, and Lord Deputy Thomas Wentworth. The Lord Deputy had assembled and trained an Irish Catholic army to fight Calvinist supporters of the National Covenant in Scotland in 1638. Charles also ordered Randall MacDonald, without the D on the end, the Earl of Antrim, to assemble an army of 5,000 of his Catholic kinsmen to aid in the suppression of the upstart supporters of the National Covenant. As this example illustrates, the politics of necessity frequently overruled issues of religion. But in the end, however, the plantation of Ulster was an economic venture, and the Roman Catholic Gaels who controlled lands were deprived of their holdings and subjected to humiliating circumstances, including the need to seek menial employment on lands that they once owned. Lands that were allocated to Catholics of good merit were typically in remote upland areas that required intensive timber harvesting before crops could be planted. Pressed between 1642 and the Stuart Restoration of 1660 were the staunchly Puritan years of the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. Irish Presbyterians suffered little under Cromwell, but his protectorate made it certain that Northern Ireland was not to be a sanctuary for their Scottish Catholic counterparts. Catholic land ownership in Ulster was eradicated, and Catholics were treated with a genocidal assault. Cromwell viewed his army's assault on Irish Catholics as the manifestation of divine retribution for the slaughter of English victims slain during the 1641 Rising. After capturing Drogheda and Wexford, Cromwell calmly allowed the slaughter of defeated militants and civilians alike. A statistician of the period, Sir William Petty, calculated that the estimated 1,448,000 inhabitants of Ireland, among them 616,000 died from the acts of war, famine, and plague. Of that number, Petty further estimated that 504,000 were native Irish. After the Restoration in 1660, Charles II tried to give relief to the Irish who had been deprived of their lands, but it's kind of a feeble effort. He sympathetically called them the innocent Irish. Well, just wait and see here. It wasn't too sympathetic in action. The Earl of Antrim, after spending time in the Tower of London for his part in supporting Charles I, was restored. In all of Ireland, according to Ford, 2/3 of the land was owned by natives prior to Cromwell's protectorate, and the reverse was true after the Restoration. By 1688, however, only 4% of the land in Ulster was owned by the native Irish Catholics. Besides religion, the plantation initiative intended to replace Gaelic with a standard form of communication. However, the lowland Scots language differed from the king's preferred dialect spoken in the south of England. Oxbridge, as we call it today. The prevailing tongue in the lowlands was Scots, a Germanic dialect that evolved from the Northumbrian variety of English after the Norman conquest in 1066. It seems that their tongue made little difference to the king because out of the 77 Scots who made application, 59 were granted land, which by 1611 amounted to 81,000 acres. English planters were also granted 81,500 acres. Of the Scots, 5 of the 59 were noblemen, all of them were lowlanders, and at least 18 were lairds from the southwestern counties of Scotland. Most of the great houses of the southwest took part. They included Sir Patrick Vans of Barnbrook, Robert McClellan, Lord Bombay, who later became Lord Kirkbride, Sir Thomas Boyd, the Cunninghams and Crawfords of South Ayrshire, John Dunbar of Mokran, and a Stuart of Garleys, and Sir Patrick McKee. Of those that took part as planters, many expressed Presbyterian orientations, as certainly most were doctrinal Calvinists. For the time, their beliefs coincided with those of the English Puritans who settled near them. As the Calvinist theologian J.I. Packer writes, theological discourse in Great Britain was an intriguing subject, for in the 17th century it was every gentleman's hobby. In other words, there was social pressure on economic and political elites to demonstrate knowledge about God regardless of their commitment to personal piety. The ease and eloquence with which a person spoke of doctrinal points, especially from a Calvinist perspective, was a mark of an educated person, and with 17th century Scotland boasting more universities than its larger neighborhood to the south, religious discourse was made a common feature of the social, economic, and political life among the country's elite leaders. This was especially true in the Southwest, where religious discourse with political overtones was intense. As a result of living on confiscated lands and amongst a people bitter toward the English monarch for its war against them, the antipathy expressed by the Irish toward the Scots Protestants caused Lord Deputy Chichester to write that they, the Irish, hate the Scottish deadly. The Anglicized Scots who settled in Ulster had, as a result of the feelings demonstrated by the native Irish, a strong incentive to maintain ties with familiar institutions, family, and friends in the old communities back home in the Bonnie Land. The western sea routes of the trans-Irish Sea culture area made the maintenance of those social and institutional linkages possible. In our next episode, we'll take a longer look at how those sea routes and social linkages facilitated the return of many Ulster Protestants to the Bonnie Land. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the subject, I invite you to read my book, In Search of Ulster Scotsland, The Birth and Geotheological Imagings of a Transatlantic People, 1603 to 1703. Until I see you again, go in peace, and God bless you and yours. Bye-bye.